On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the upcoming meeting of NATO leaders in London. What's on the security agenda? What's next for the alliance? And the fledgling U.S. Space Command taking off. Where's the new U.S. combatant force headed? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you on CGTN from Beijing. Let's begin today's show with the upcoming NATO leaders meeting. Marking the alliance's 70th anniversary, transatlantic leaders from the alliance's 29 members will meet in London on December the 3rd and 4th. This year's agenda includes the fight against terrorism, countering hybrid threats, collective security, and transatlantic relations. Hanging over the meeting are controversies over a fairer burden sharing of defense spending. So what's the outlook of this meeting? Before we turn to our panelists from those NATO countries, take a look at this first.
Tomorrow, NATO leaders meet in London for a special summit to mark the start of the alliance 70 years ago, during the Cold War. It was a time when members agreed on their aims and who the enemy was. Today, NATO leaders are politically polarized, and some are questioning the effectiveness of one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest, military alliance. French President Emmanuel Macron recently called the alliance brain dead and declared terrorism is now the enemy, not Russia or China. Mr. Macron wants this to be a wake-up call.
The questions I've asked are open questions that we haven't solved yet. Peace in Europe, the post-INF situation, the relationship with Russia, the Turkey issue, who's the enemy? So I say, as long as these questions are not resolved, let's not negotiate about cost sharing and burden sharing.
But the comments drew a sharp rebuke within the alliance. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently said NATO members often had different opinions, but it didn't mean the alliance has no future.
The European Union cannot defend Europe. European unity cannot replace transatlantic unity. A strong NATO and a strong European Union are two sides of the same coin.
With some of its key members expected to bring conflicting agendas at this year's meeting, what was conceived as a celebration for NATO could become a show of disunity. One challenge topping the agenda is the Syria discord with two NATO members, the U.S. and Turkey. Where American troops once kept the peace, Russian forces now patrol northern Syria. The U.S. withdrawal last month has fueled concerns over America's commitment to NATO. To make matters worse, Turkey is buying S-400 Russian anti-missile systems. Analysts believe, just like the NATO summit held last year in Brussels, this year's meeting is not going to be smooth sailing. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Turkey, and now Ukraine. Security challenges facing the alliance are more complicated.
So what's the outlook on the NATO summit? In Washington, we have John Stylides, principal at Trilogy Advisor. In Brussels, we have Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. In Beijing, Teng Jianchun, director of the Center for Arms Control with the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you, Mr. Cameron. The French president claimed that NATO these days is brain dead. Your response to that remark, and what's going on about the future ideas and potential of NATO?
I think President Macron wanted to provoke a debate within NATO about the future of the alliance, given the doubts about the American commitment, basically because of some of the comments President Trump has made, and also his decision to pull US troops out of northern Syria without consulting NATO. So I think Macron certainly achieved his objective, and this will certainly be on the agenda when the NATO summit actually takes place.
I see, but do you think building a think tank or an expert panel, so-called, will be able to solve the problem? Mr. Cameron, very briefly, before we go to the other guests.
No, not at all. But I think there's two NATOs at work here. There's the NATO, the political NATO, where there's constant disputes about what the priority should be, and there's the military NATO, which actually operates very concretely in terms of building up new facilities, particularly in Eastern Europe. So you have to take the two into account.
Mr. Stylianides, sitting in Washington, do you agree with that two layers of NATO illustrated by Mr. Cameron in Brussels?
I think it's a very apt description of the situation we face with NATO today. The political part is going to be the problem that is going to be sorted out at the summit. What you have is a concern that there is an anachronistic institution that dates back half a century, really for a 20th century global landscape, and it really has not geopolitically or strategically reconfigured for the new threats and security concerns of the 21st century. And on a military level, the countries that are in the NATO alliance do tend to cooperate and to collaborate relatively effectively, but on a political level, you have an enormously bloated bureaucracy in Belgium, and you have the concern that there really is no such thing as Europe to speak of, that Poland and Portugal have very different security needs, Finland and France, Estonia and Ireland. And we have increasing disputes between the United States and Germany over defense budgeting, and of course between the U.S. and many NATO countries with Turkey, now that it's acquiring and soon to be activating very problematic Russian anti-aircraft missile systems.
Mr. Tang, you've been listening to your colleagues from Brussels and Washington. Of course, China is not part of the NATO, but rather China is concerned whether some of the capitals are trying to bring China as, quote-unquote, the threat for NATO. Mr. Tang, your thoughts?
Actually, this is a continuation of so-called China threat from the United States. In recent years, we repeatedly have heard such a voice from some member state of NATO, and of course this is a result of the propaganda by the United States. And you mentioned just now the brain is dead. Actually, the brain of NATO is the United States. In any military blocks established by the United States since the end of World War II, there is always only one boss and only one head in the military organization or military alliance. So this time, I'm sure some state members of NATO would like to say China is a threat. Even the Secretary General, sometimes criticized China's policy. I don't know these gentlemen are familiar with the situation in China or in the development of China. They just follow the suit of the United States.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Cameron, you got two very different opinions there. Mr. Stylianides suggesting that it's the EU countries themselves that are problem here. They better figure out what they want. While Mr. Tang is concerned that whether China will be, being described as the threat for NATO, is it going to be good for NATO's future development, though? So, Mr. Cameron, you want to respond on both sides?
Well, on the European side, there are clearly different threat perceptions, whether you're sitting in Estonia or in Portugal. I mean, the southern Mediterranean countries look to North Africa and the threat of Islamic terrorism and radicalization as a top threat, whereas if you're sitting in Poland or Estonia, you look to Russia as the threat. So that's always been the case, and I think it's trying to get the balance right, and I think that's what NATO has usually managed to do. In terms of China, I don't think anyone sees China as a particular threat to NATO, but I think there is concern that China is expanding its footprint, firstly in the Balkans, secondly in the Arctic, and that's coming close to sort of NATO's core territory. So it's simply natural that NATO wants to keep an eye to monitor what China is doing, but nobody is saying China is a threat to NATO at the moment.
But Mr. Cameron, on the other hand, though, who will drive the agenda of NATO? I think that is a very key issue here. Now, the world has been used to, at least in the western part of the world, northern part of the world, used to the U.S. leading the way. Now the U.S. is kind of withdrawing most of the time from the multilateral frameworks earlier established quite instrumentally by itself. But so in a way, what does that mean for NATO, and who will drive the next stage of NATO? If I could ask that question, your thoughts?
it will still be the United States. The United States provides overwhelmingly the largest military forces for NATO, so it has a dominant voice, and this always has been the case. There have been political disputes, as John mentioned before, but even despite Trump's comments, the military, the Pentagon, are absolutely committed to the future of the NATO alliance, and although there might well continue to be political disagreements in future, the United States will remain the dominant partner for sure.
I know. It seems interesting because the expert panel now, the NATO leaders have been talking about, is going to put out, as planned earlier, Mr. Situlidis, a future report in a way. But that report will not be available until after the U.S. election, which NATO, quote unquote, believes it will be neutral as a result of it. So, Mr. Situlidis, do you think the agenda, domestic political agenda of the U.S. and the timetable of the U.S. will in a way decide the timetable of NATO looking for a future agenda and future timetable?
The political situation will affect that planning to a certain degree, and that's only natural in any democratic nation. The decisions of government leaders have to reflect the democratic wishes as expressed through the ballot box of their respective voters, and that's certainly the case inside the NATO alliance. And you have 2.5 dozen countries, each of which have their respective political processes, which are going to be respected. And of course, the United States election will play a dominant role going forward. But
even the U.S. election will have a dominating
Fraser,
impact on the strategic decision and direction of NATO. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I think it goes back to Fraser's apt comment earlier, because on a military level, the establishments have worked quite well through all of these political disputes of the last several years and the last several decades. But on a political level, yes, countries have to decide to what extent they're going to be participating in a reconstruction of the NATO mission. They have to sign off on the budgeting. I mean, when Germany is pledged to spend about 1.2%, not 2% of its GDP on defense budgeting for the next decade, that's a problem for other countries because the German government's respecting the wishes of the German people. But I want to go back to the China point also, because I think China is not considered an immediate threat, but I do believe that you will see China emerging in potential arms control discussions going forward, so that where the U.S. and Russia are reworking an arms control framework, that the U.S. and maybe other countries in NATO will be urging China to participate in that framework, and also the degree to which British and French ships are engaged in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, along with those of the United States.
Right. Mr. Tang, of course, that's a natural question for you. Now, if Washington managed to penetrate furthermore into the decision by NATO regarding China, how is China likely to work out its future relationship with NATO? Now, China and NATO were not close, but over the past few years, there have been quite some interactions on some of the not necessarily strategically crucial missions, let's just put it that way, but do have some interaction. So, Mr. Tang, is the potential worrisome, or is the potential actually should be very much expected with hope?
I think 20 years ago, there was a debate whether China should enter such a military organization at home in China, I mean. And today, I'm sure China would like to have a good cooperation with any country in NATO or in other military organizations, even established by the United States. So this is actually our basic principle, to establish the cooperation with any military organization in regional affairs, in global affairs, or even in the anti-piracy in the Aden Bay. China did have good cooperation with member states of NATO in fighting against the pirates there. So this is actually a good example for China to cooperate with any organization in maintaining the peace and stability in everywhere in the world.
But Mr. Tang, what about the controversial issues Mr. Stylianides earlier suggested, at least from China's perspective? What if NATO, it is in the name of NATO those things happened? How is China likely to deal with those potentials? And how do you think NATO countries and NATO as a whole should understand the Chinese approach at this point?
Yeah, there are quite a few channels for the two sides to have good exchanges on various issues, including terrorism, including anti-piracy. So this is a challenge, I think, for China and for NATO member states. So we can have a further in-depth discussion with our counterpart from NATO at this moment or in the future.
In-depth discussion about what, Mr. Tang? That's very important, because anti-piracy, you said the two sides already working together. What about the controversial territory disputes, and also what about the future potential of defense needs of China in some of the areas where NATO consider as important to itself?
I think number one is for the two sides, we should have a good understanding on the policy. For example, China's defense policy is defensive. We always said that we should not only look at the capability but also look at the intention of China. How can we have such a large amount of military budget and have such a large program for the arsenals in China, not only conventional arms in China, also the nuclear weapon system. And as gentlemen just mentioned, I think nuclear arm disarmament is a good topic for the two sides to have in-depth exploration.
Yeah.
How can we cooperate?
Now here's the thing, Mr. Cameron, I have to come back to you, because it is not just about whether the quote-unquote common threat of NATO will be expanded, but also what's likely to happen if Washington, given the current circumstances, would rather have a more passive role on the future development of NATO. What if the two sides on political strategic issues may not see eye to eye with one another, I mean the European countries and Washington, for the near future, which is already reflected on trade issues, also reflected on some of the other political issues around the world. Iran is also one of them. So, Mr. Cameron, may I throw back this difficult question to you once again?
Well, I actually think the Americans have a point. I mean, for 50 years, they have certainly borne the brunt of military expenditure defending Europe. And now, if you look at the situation from an American taxpayer's perspective, you look across the Atlantic and you see 500 million pretty rich Europeans who have a GDP per head as high as the United States, and you ask yourself, well, why are they not capable of defending themselves?
But Mr. Cameron, here's the thing. You could be empathetic, okay, to anyone about what they think or what they say, but whether the actions taken by nation states within NATO will necessarily follow that line of thinking and that line of action prescribed by the others is another question. So empathy does not equal to action. So help me to understand what's likely to be the actions if the capitals do not see eye to eye on some of the strategic issues, Mr. Cameron.
Well, they do actually see eye to eye on many of the strategic issues. The threat from Russia, the threat of hybrid attacks, the threat from radical Islam, etc. They're all on the same page on that.
Yeah.
Where they differ, obviously, is in contributions to the alliance and what the focus should be going forward. Now, they've just had a ministerial and agreed that space should now be included on the agenda. They basically have a framework for dealing with, out-of-area threats too. So, on 90% of issues, they basically are on the same page.
All right. Mr. Stylianides, now, the U.S. president is to participate, according to the plan, at least. So, usually it's dramatic moments when he participates. Can we expect anything specific this time?
It's tough to tell until he's actually arrived, and all of the government leaders are convening for. We're going to be some very important issues at the 70th summit. My own sense is that President Trump will continue to hammer away directly on what he feels are the defense budgeting shortfalls of certain NATO countries. I think what you'll have there are key advisors to President Trump, along with their counterparts in NATO countries, talking on a more strategic level about how to address issues regarding Russia, regarding Islamic terror. What is going to be the future of Ukraine, for instance, and other countries that are aspiring for membership in the NATO alliance? So I think this will happen on a dual-level process, but my own sense is that President Trump sees this in a very transactional manner, and from a purely fairness perspective, as Fraser began to comment earlier, why is it that these wealthy European Union countries are not stepping up to the plate to meet what is a simple commitment from the U.S., especially as for instance, in the case of Germany, are increasing their economic dependence on countries such as Russia that they're supposed to be defended from by the United States and other NATO countries.
I see.
It doesn't quite fit.
Mr. Cameron, now, it's about whether the capitals involved in NATO are going to take President Trump seriously, because there's an impeachment going on in Washington. There are a lot of things going on politically as well. There's an election next year. And meanwhile, there are trade issues between many European capitals and Washington as well. Is the current status of Washington going to be taken seriously, or rather people would like to postpone it until, how about after election?
Well, to be frank, it doesn't really matter who is the president, because whether it was Obama or Bush before him, there was a similar message coming from Washington, basically that the Europeans have to do more.
Mr. Teng, final words from you as well about the upcoming summit?
Yeah, I think this is a very important moment for NATO member states. How can they continue the process in defending the countries in European continent and for its allies? I think at this moment the big challenge for NATO is the United States. There is only one driver in the bus, and if Donald Trump would like to withdraw his military spending in this regard, or withdraw troops from European continent, that might be a disaster for the military organization or the ending of the military organization. So I think all the member states should think about the result and how can they deal with such a present from the United States.
When you say that, I'm sure a lot of those involved in the discussion already have sweat in their hands. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for joining us and helping us to understand much better about the agenda, possibly, for the NATO summit. We have John Sitilidis, Fraser Cameron, and Teng Jianchun. Thank you so much, gentlemen.